this is Warhawk Beyond 2040, and today I want to discuss with all of you about the moment that I became a fan of The Flash. And for those of you who know me personally, The Flash is one of my all time favourite DC characters. He is in my top five with Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern. And I have always considered The Flash to be right up there with those guys in terms of historic importance and iconic status. And my gateway into the world of The Flash began in 1998 when I first started collecting comic books. And my early introductions to The Flash were the DC Adventures annuals, but I became more into The Flash when I got a graphic novel compilation called The Greatest Flash Stories Ever Told, which compiled some of the best Flash stories from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, all the way up to the mid 80s, just before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And The Flash as a character has had quite an interesting history in animated media. He made one notable appearance in Superman the Animated Series. He was part of the Super Friends shows back in the 70s up to the mid 80s. And of course, he appeared in a number of animated shorts back in the late 60s as part of the Filmation series. But compared to guys like Superman and Batman, to name a few, the Flash's presence in animated media was not as strong as Superman and Batman, but it wasn't until the early 2000s when we got the Justice League animated series, which was shown on Toonami, that the Flash played a big role in the show and was portrayed as a key player in the team. Now, the Flash that I grew up with was Wally West. Now, everyone knows, of course, that Barry Allen is the iconic Flash, but for me, growing up, Wally West was my guy. When someone says to me, "Who's the first guy you think of when it comes to the Flash?" I say, "Wally West. He's my guy." Barry Allen has his place in history. He's the man, of course. Jay Garrick, of course, is the first. But for me, Wally West, he's my guy. He's my Flash. And throughout the first two seasons of the Justice League, the Flash was more or less played up for comic relief. He would have his serious moments, but he was always the big goofball, making jokes and things like that. But occasionally he would be coming through and have a big moment, but he never really had a defining episode. He never really had that big moment where people would stand up and say, "Did you see what the Flash did?" Or "Do you remember that episode when the Flash did that?" Flash was never really pushed as that guy. You know, Guys like John Stewart had an episode to themselves, like in Blackest Night. Wonder Woman was featured quite promptly in Paradise Lost. Superman and Batman would often be pushed quite hard, and for obvious reasons. But the Flash, he was more or less like the guy in the background. The biggest role he played in the first two seasons of the Justice League was perhaps the show's best episode ever, A Better World. Although he didn't have a big dominant role in the traditional sense, his importance to the Justice League was, highlighted very clearly that he was the conscience of the group. So that in itself made the Flash an important and integral part of the Justice League. And Wally West being my favorite Flash, I sat there hoping and wondering, when is the Flash going to get that defining episode? When's he going to have his big moment. Well, that big moment would come in Justice League Unlimited, in one of the show's best episodes ever, Divided We Fall, which was part of the big Cadmus story arc. And we saw the Flash go up against a Brainiac construct of himself in the form of Professor Zoom. Now, as we all know, the Justice Lords never had their Flash because he was already murdered at the hands of President Lex Luthor. So it was quite hilarious to see, you know, the Flash going up against his evil doppelganger, even though it technically wasn't real. And then the moment that cemented me as a fan of the Flash was when he took down the Lex Luthor Brainiac combo and essentially destroyed them. You know, he had that big moment where he ran as fast as he could ever run and just absolutely took Lex Luthor and Brainiac apart. And he ended up getting teleported into the Speed Force. And it was a fantastic moment. Wally West wasn't the goofball anymore. He was the fastest man alive. He was the Scarlet Speedster. And it was a great moment to see the Flash take down perhaps two of the biggest villains ever in the DCAU, Lex Luthor and Brainiac. And I was so happy. Finally, my guy has got his big moment. And that little bit at the end when he said, I don't think I can ever run fast like that again because if I do, I don't think I'm ever coming back. Just chills, just pure chills. Flash with his costume ripped to shreds, shaking after doing the unthinkable. Because if I said to someone, who's your pick to take down a fused Lex Luthor and Brainiac? The obvious answer would be, well, Superman, of course. He knows those two better than anyone. But then I would probably ask, okay, who would be the next one after? Batman, of course. Maybe Wonder Woman. Green Lantern, 50-50. The Flash wouldn't be that guy. But that was the moment that cemented me as the fan of the Flash. He took down Lex Luthor and Brainiac and just wiped them out. And it was a fantastic moment, probably one of the best moments of the show's entire run. And even though the Flash wasn't like had the biggest amount of screen time in Divided We Fall, just those few minutes made him one of the best ever. And Flash actually did get to have his own defining episode shortly after in another great episode called Flash and Substance, where members of his rogues gallery joined forces to wreck his Appreciation Day. And we had Batman and Orion working with the Flash to stop his rogues gallery. That came after Divided We Fall. But for me, the moment that made me a fan of the Flash was when the Flash took down and defeated both Lex Luthor and Brainiac in the Justice League Unlimited episode, Divided We Fall. Absolutely loved it. One of the show's best episodes ever and featured one of the show's most iconic moments of the entire DCAU as far as I'm concerned. But there was one more moment that came after Divided We Fall, and that was in Flash and Substance. And at the end of that episode, after the Flash defeated the Rogues with Batman and Orion's help, we learned a very interesting secret about the Flash. It wasn't his secret identity, it was about what he represented as a hero. And Orion pretty much said to the Flash, now I understand. You pretend to act like a fool to hide a warrior's pain. That line said to me that the Flash only pretends to act like a fool to keep his enemies off balance and pretty much let his enemies know that they wouldn't see him coming. Because if his enemies knew that the Flash was this super serious guy, they would probably want to take him out even more. But the fact that the Flash pretends to act silly keeps his enemies off balance and they're not going to take him that seriously. So that gives the Flash a bit of an edge. And I love what the Flash said at the end of that episode. He pretty much said, and this was one of those rare serious moments that we get from Wally West. They say, look, the bad guys got caught and nobody got hurt. You know what I call that? A really good day. That to me cemented the Flash even more as one of my favorites. And I think that moment he really earned the respect of both Batman and especially Orion. I mean, Batman does respect the Flash, but I think that moment, I think that just cemented Batman's respect for him even more. And I think Orion will probably next time think twice about making fun of the Flash. And he pretty much looked at it like, you know what? Maybe this Flash guy isn't such a goofball after all. Tremendous stuff. Little things like that made me a bigger fan of the Flash. And I like the fact that he acts silly just to keep everyone off balance. I think that's really cool. But we all know that the Flash is a very serious, smart guy. So that's going to be it from me. I am going to wrap this up now. What was the moment that made you a fan of The Flash? Was it in Divided We Fall when The Flash defeated Lex Luthor and Brainiac? Was it in Flash and Substance? Or do you have another episode from the Justice League shows that made you a fan of The Flash? Was it through the comic books or was it from earlier shows like the Filmation Run or Super Friends? You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will see all of you next time. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.